Welcome to the final part of the story. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I recommend going back and starting there. Here's how it all ends. The first night after the ruling, I slept without dreaming, and the absence felt like weather that had finally made up its mind. When I woke, the house held stillness that didn't need explanation. It wasn't the hush of dread anymore. It was a pause with room in it. I made tea, then a second cup I didn't need, only because rituals take time and I wanted the morning to last. The court order lay on the table beside Uncle Martin's last letter and the silver dollar. Paper, ink, metal three-weights that anchored the room and, for once, didn't ask to be lifted. I had the impulse to call my parents and tell them that nothing had changed and everything had that love, as we understood it, would not be redistributed by forms, but I didn't. There are truces that arrive only when no one announces them. Instead, I called the tax attorney. Mr. Peterson recommended and scheduled something I wrote on my calendar as Adulthood, Part 2. The logistics began to stack like tidily folded towels. Probate filings closed. Account titles changed. A new trust formed with my name in a font that looked too formal to belong to me. I learned the vocabulary of having without performing basis, fiduciary, corpus, charitable remainder, words that sounded like an old cathedral and behaved like a ledger. In the afternoons, I opened Martin's notebooks and read the parts that had once felt theoretical. Liquidity is for living, not hoarding. Diversify where you'd rather not be surprised. Measure generosity by whether it outlives you. He hadn't written these to be wise. He'd written them to remember his own rules. It made them easier to follow. The Martin Price Scholarship Fund began as a file folder with a post-it on top that said "Start small. Start true." I drafted a mission statement at the dining table with a pencil I sharpened too often. First-generation students in accounting and finance, with demonstrated steadiness, I chose that word, steadiness, because it named the virtue no one had clapped for when I was young. A friend at work introduced me to an attorney who specialized in nonprofits. We filed articles of incorporation. We built a website that did not promise to change the world, only to change the semester. The first application arrived 2 months later in an envelope addressed in deliberate print, each letter standing at attention. It came from a girl in the Bronx whose mother cleaned offices at night. She wrote that numbers made sense to her when people didn't, and that if someone would help her get to Baruch, she'd promise to come back for those who came next. I cried at my dining table and said yes. Ryan visited on Sundays. We didn't call it that or make it a ritual, but somehow the day found us. Sometimes he'd show up with bagels that steamed when we opened the paper bag. Sometimes he brought nothing and we made grilled cheese like we were still 12 and 15 and trying to feed ourselves without starting a fire. He never mentioned our parents unless I asked. When I did, he'd say they were fine, the way people say a fixture is fine, functional, present, not worth examining. I wouldn't have believed my mother capable of silence, yet months went by without a single call. My father sent one email titled Appeal with no body text, only an attachment of a brief they never filed. It arrived at 3:17 a.m., the hour of arguments that can't stand daylight. We pretended we were living through a normal winter. We discussed the Knicks like their record mattered to our breathing. We watched documentaries about parks I'd never seen and learned facts we'd forget by morning. He showed me a photo of the woman he'd started seeing, a nurse named Emily, with a tired smile that looked like confidence, not defeat. She's quiet in crowded rooms, he said, which sounded like praise. One Sunday, he brought over a puzzle, one of those 1,000-piece landscapes where the river is a long language of blue. We worked in companionable silence at the dining table, two introverts making order at the edge of chaos. At some point he set a piece in place and sat back, pleased. I used to think life was about finding corner pieces, he said. Turns out it's more about sorting blues. Corner pieces are an illusion, I said, and we both smiled, because we'd earned the right to say it. Therapy came recommended by a woman at the nonprofit clinic who had watched a lot of first-gen stories twist under the weight of family. The therapist's office was in a renovated Victorian on a hill, all soft carpets and tactful lighting. She had the kind of face that didn't flinch. The first session I talked in the clean sentences of someone trained to write copy. This happened, then this, and here is why the brand suffered. She listened and somehow made silence feel participatory. "Dear parents love you?" she asked finally. I wanted to be generous. "Yes," I said. Then I added the sentence that came with it whether I invited it or not. "They loved me" in the future tense. Explain. If I did this, if I stopped that, if I became, then yes. I looked at my hands. Uncle Martin loved me in the present tense. She nodded. "So you learned to earn love." And then I learned to keep it from costing too much. "And now?" she asked. I stared at the rug, the pattern repeating itself like a well-meaning mistake. "Now I'm trying to spend it some, without feeling like I'm wasting it." We talked about boundaries as if they were rooms with doors, not walls. We talked about money as a megaphone that could turn whispers into feedback. We talked about guilt the way you talk about whether a condition, not a verdict. At the end of the hour she said, "Your parents' grief for the will and their grief for the child they thought they had are the same feeling wearing different outfits." I laughed, surprised. "So I'm not the villain." "You could be," she said, kind and unsparing. "Anyone could be. But you aren't." Spring unfurled itself along the stone wall by the driveway, a conspiracy of crocuses. I started running in the mornings, the way people do when they've decided to live in their bodies on purpose. The river was often a pewter strip in the distance if I made it to the ridge trail in time. I counted breaths like I had in the pool. 1, 2, 3, breathe. It was humbling and useful to feel how air puts you in your place without humiliating you. At work, my boss who thought in slides asked if I wanted to take on a financial services client that made headlines for the wrong reasons. "You're good at making hard things sound human," she said. I declined. "I don't want my rent paid by euphemism," I told her. She blinked. Later she offered me a different account, and I took it. It was a small choice that let me recognize myself in the mirror. The foundation awarded 3 scholarships that first year. The ceremony was 8 of us in my dining room with cupcakes and paper plates. We took photos on the porch that made the house look like it had rehearsed hospitality. The students hugged me the way people hug news, and in every one of them I saw a version of a girl who used to whisper please to rooms that didn't owe her anything. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the porch swing with a blanket around my shoulders. The maple tree threw shade across the lawn like a prophecy I didn't feel entitled to read. We did it, I told the air, and for the first time, I didn't look up to see if anyone approved. Summer brought heat that made even good decisions feel heavy. I visited the cemetery on a Tuesday when the groundskeeper was cutting the grass in long, obedient lines. I sat cross-legged beside Martin's headstone and read him the scholarship essays out loud. It should have felt silly, it didn't. There is dignity in reporting back to the dead. On my way out, I ran into Mrs. Klein at the gate. She pressed a Tupperware of brownies into my hands the way older women hand over absolution. "He'd be proud," she said. "Of what?" I asked, genuinely, because the act of earning pride had been my occupation for so long. "Of your steadiness," she said. "There are louder ways to live. They don't last." In August, Ryan asked if I wanted to meet Emily. We chose a diner near the hospital where she worked nights. She slid into the booth like someone who didn't need the chair to prove she belonged. Her smile wasn't performance, it was hospitality. I liked her immediately. They told me the story of their almost meet-cute. He left a coffee in the elevator. She returned it with an eyebrow. He made a joke. She didn't laugh. He tried again, and she did. Emily asked me questions I didn't realize I wanted to answer. How the foundation selected applicants, whether I'd kept any of Martin's furniture, what the best part of my job was on days that didn't feel worth it. My parents came up near the end, because avoiding a subject that large turns it into gravity. Emily listened without choosing sides. When I finished, she said, simply, "It sounds like everyone did their best with their worst habits." I drove home feeling something unusual, hope that didn't require a counterweight. The second legal ripple arrived in September, thin as paper and just as capable of giving a sharp cut. A letter from Wells, my parents' attorney, respectfully inquiring whether I planned to make equitable provision for the sibling branch of the family as part of my ongoing stewardship. It wasn't a threat, it was a test. I drafted 3 responses. One was a page of anger I printed just to admire how honest it looked. One was a paragraph of compromise that made me feel clever and dead at the same time. The one I sent was 4 sentences long. The court has ruled. I am honoring Martin's wishes and building the foundation he would have loved. I wish my parents well. I wish you good billing hours. I didn't add please or thank you. Courtesy wasn't owed to a question asked like that. I half expected my parents to retaliate with silence, which is still a kind of noise. Instead, a card arrived in my mother's precise hand, the letters controlled as if emotion could be kept to the lines. The neighborhood misses your hydrangeas. No mention of the estate. No apologies. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer with all the other maybes of our future. That fall, I renovated Martin's office in a way that kept the room's grammar intact. Same desk, same clock, new chair that didn't insist on posture. I put a corkboard on the wall and pinned the students' acceptance letters in chronological order, like a secular litany. When the heater rattled, the notes trembled, and I liked the way it looked, proof that we were not paper alone. The foundation grew slowly, politely. A former colleague introduced me to a CPA who offered pro bono audits because your uncle once helped my dad with a tax mess and didn't charge him. A banker at the branch where Gomez worked invited me to present the scholarship to their employee resource group. I practiced the talk at my dining table, then gave it to a crowd of 20 who took notes as if steadiness were a technique. After, a teller in her 50s hugged me. When my son got his award last year, she said, he held the check like it was heavy, like he finally believed he could carry something. I drove home wanting to write to Martin. See? The wait is useful. Winter pressed its gray face to the windows. Holidays arrived in their assigned order, carrying their luggage. Ryan and Emily spent Thanksgiving with me, and we cooked with the mutual humility of amateurs. We burned the rolls and laughed like people whose hunger could be met by other foods. Between the turkey and the pie, Ryan got quiet in that way that means a big sentence is looking for its verb. Emily and I are thinking about getting married, he said. The room rearranged itself around the news, the way rooms do when you've been waiting for them to. I'm happy, I said, and the ease with which the truth came out surprised me. We'll keep it small, he said. No performance. Just vows and sandwiches. Sandwiches, I said, approving. The sacrament of people who intend to continue later. He laughed. I want you there, he said, needing me to believe it. Front row. Tears came fast, not the old acid kind, but warm, serviceable. I nodded. I'll bring the good napkins. They set a date in May at a park by the river where pigeons behaved like citizens and the lawn pretended no one had ever had a difficult conversation on it. When the invitations went out, I was surprised to see my parents' names on the list and surprised again that I was surprised. The world had become large enough to hold contradictions without exploding. The week before the wedding, my mother called. I recognized the number and let it ring twice so my voice would arrive with dignity. Her hello was cautious, as if the word itself might comment on us. I hear you're well, she said. I hear the same about you, I replied. She exhaled. I've been thinking. So have I said, because it was true either way. Your brother wants us all there, she said. Your father thinks. She stopped, recalibrated. I think we should be there for him. The pronoun, at last, was correct. Yes, I said. You should. A pause stretched, filled with the ghosts of every argument we'd had and didn't have. Claire, she said, and my name in her mouth was a fragile object. We wrote a letter a while back. I don't know if you got it. I did. Another pause, then, I'm glad. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a hallway with the lights on. The wedding day opened like a clean page. Sun across the water, a wind that behaved itself. The ceremony was 20 minutes of sentences that meant it, promises not shouted, but placed carefully where they could be found later. Emily wore a dress that would still look like her in photos decades from now. Ryan cried for 1 second, then laughed at himself, and we all laughed with him, and that felt like a vow too. My parents arrived together, dignified in clothes they knew how to use. We stood within the same geography but not yet the same conversation. During the recessional, my mother touched my elbow. You look well, she said. So do you, I answered, because she did, and because grammar mattered to us even when intimacy didn't. At the reception sandwiches, as promised, we sat at separate tables that weren't very separate. I watched my father watch Ryan and thought about the arithmetic of pride, how people add and subtract themselves from others to make the sim more bearable. Later, when the cake had been cut and a child had fallen asleep under a coat, my father approached me with his hands in his pockets, the only position in which he looked uncertain. "I'm glad you came," he said. "It's my brother's wedding," I said, and he nodded like the fact had rescued him. "We didn't appeal," he added, unnecessarily. "I know." He swallowed. "You're doing something good." I didn't trust what would happen if I added words to that, so I put my hand on his sleeve. It was the smallest possible forgiveness, and it was not a promise, but it was, I realized, a start. That night, after the lights were packed and the sandwiches were proof of sincerity only in smudges, I sat in the quiet kitchen and wrote a letter to Martin I would not mail. "We are not fixed," I began. "We are furniture that can be moved without breaking. The scholarship has 6 students now. One called me to say she got an A in statistics and then cried because no one in her family knew what that meant. I told her it means she can read the weather. Ryan married a good woman who measures her days by who can breathe easier at the end of them. Mother and father are learning how to stand in a room with me without rehearsing. The practice is imperfect. The room is still a room. I haven't spent the coin. I carry it. Some days I need its weight. Some days I forget it's there and realize that's the point. I'm trying to build." You were right. Integrity compounds quietly. I think of you when the coffee maker clicks off and the house goes small and true. The math holds, even when the numbers are people. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with my mother's card and the first scholarship application. Not because I needed to keep proof, but because I liked the way the papers looked together, a ledger of attempts. The summer after the wedding, the foundation moved out of my dining room and into Martin's old office properly, with a second-hand filing cabinet and a whiteboard that collected verbs. Mentor. Call. Listen. Ask. We held volunteer nights where we read applications aloud and argued kindly about what steadiness looked like. Sometimes it looked like an A+, sometimes it looked like a C earned during a season when everything else fell down. A young man from Yonkers who had cared for his grandfather wrote an essay that didn't know it was beautiful. We gave him a scholarship, and he sent a thank you note with handwriting that made me want to be careful with my replies forever. A woman from Queens who had started over at 32 with 2 kids and a tired car wrote about accounting as if it were a moral practice. We said yes and cried in the kitchen afterward. On Tuesday nights, Ryan and Emily came for dinner when she wasn't on shift. We ate food that lived within our confidence and sometimes beyond it. They told me about the apartment they were saving for, the plant that refused to cooperate, the one vacation they took by accident when a friend gifted them a week in a cabin that had more flies than promises, but a lake that made up the difference. We didn't talk about my parents, because not talking was sometimes the only way not to make them the center. When one of us slipped and said Mom or Dad too loudly, the other would refill a glass, move a plate, perform a small kindness so the sentence would feel escorted to its seat. In September, a brown envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a faded photo of 2 boys, my father and Martin at a summer lake, skin burned, grinning, each with an arm slung over the other's shoulder. On the back, in my grandmother's slanted hand, "My men, 1968. No note. No explanation. Perhaps my mother had sent it, or my father had, or a drawer had simply decided to share. I set the photo on the mantel beside Martin's quiet frame. It didn't exonerate anyone. It didn't accuse. It widened the room. That night, I dreamed for the first time in months. Not of courtrooms or stairwells or pens. I dreamed of a porch swing, of someone saying keep the coin where you can find it, and of air arriving on time when counted. Time didn't gallop. It unfolded soft and deliberate, the way a tide remembers the shore. Years went by measured in scholarship classes, not birthdays. Each autumn, a new stack of essays arrived, smelling faintly of printer ink and ambition. I read every one by hand, red pen in the margin, notes like steady voice or unnecessary apology, both things I recognized in myself. The foundation grew. What began as a line item in my savings became a program with real reach, mentoring sessions, internship partnerships, financial literacy workshops in libraries. The board stayed small by design, 5 of us, sitting around the same desk that had once belonged to Martin. We kept the coffee strong, the minutes short, the purpose long. Every success came with an echo, the sound of Martin's calm voice asking, "And what will you do next?" I always had an answer now. Ryan and Emily bought a small house in Terrytown. White shutters, a lemon tree in a pot by the door, a porch that wanted stories. I spent more weekends there than I expected, helping paint, babysitting their rescue dog, fixing the wobbly stair rail Martin would have noticed first. When they told me Emily was pregnant, I laughed before I cried. "I'm going to be an aunt?" Ryan grinned. "You'll be the kind that spoils with advice, not sugar." "Then she'll be insufferably balanced," I said. They didn't learn the baby's sex, but somehow I knew it would be a girl. Our parents came to visit the week after the baby was born. Ryan had insisted if they're going to meet their grandchild, it should be while everyone still wants them to. The air that day was cautious but breathable. My mother brought soup. My father brought a teddy bear with a price tag, still attached evidence of last-minute repentance. Emily, radiant and exhausted, welcomed them anyway. I arrived late, carrying flowers from my garden. My mother looked up as I entered the living room, her hands folded, her hair now silver and soft. For the first time in years, she looked smaller than the sum of her decisions. "She's beautiful," I said, peering into the bassinet. "She is," my mother whispered, and then, as if the air had asked for honesty, "I hope we do better this time." I met her eyes. "So do I." That was all. No forgiveness ceremony, no apology engraved in marble. Just a shared wish, the kind that plants itself quietly and waits for spring. The baby was named Clara, and I loved her the way sunlight loves glass through, not over. She grew in the rhythm of our rebuilt family, Sunday visits, birthdays that arrived without pretense, phone calls that didn't have to be strategic. My father grew gentler with her. Age and shame had carved out a hollow, and Clara filled it without trying. When she was 2, he started calling her my lucky penny. I let him. He never said the same about me, but I didn't need it anymore. On the 5th anniversary of the foundation, we held a gala, our first large event. 100 people, linen-covered tables, lights strung across the rented hall like small intentions. I stood at the podium, papers trembling slightly in my hand. "Uncle Martin taught me that integrity compounds quietly," I began, and a hush settled like dust on polished wood. "He also taught me that money is only a mirror." Tonight, when I look around, I see reflection of effort, of faith, of futures not yet written. There were polite smiles, real smiles, the sound of forks being set down. Somewhere in the crowd, Ryan and Emily beamed. My mother dabbed her eyes discreetly. My father clapped too long and too loud, but for once, I didn't flinch from it. After the speeches, a student named Alyssa approached me. She'd just graduated from Fordham and accepted a position in a major firm. "You don't know me," she said shyly, "but your foundation changed my life. My mom says you must have an angel watching over you." "I do," I said, smiling. "But I also have a ledger and you're on it now. So keep your side balanced." She laughed, a sound so young it made hope audible. When Martin's house finally needed a new roof, I stood in the yard watching the shingles come down like slow rain. The workers shouted and joked, and the rhythm of their hammers reminded me of breath. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Inside, the clock he'd wound every Sunday still ticked. I'd had it cleaned once, but the rest I left as it was. Its imperfection made it truer time. Like people, didn't need to run smoothly to be worth keeping. That evening, I pulled out the box of his journals and chose one at random. A note I'd missed before was scrawled on the inside cover. "If you ever wonder what to do next, build something worth explaining to a child." I looked toward the porch where Clara had played with her stacking cups that morning and thought, I'm trying. When Clara turned 6, she asked me why there was always a silver coin on my desk. "It's a reminder," I said. "Of what?" "That worth doesn't fade," I told her. "It just changes what it looks like." She held the coin carefully, small fingers tracing its worn edge. "Can I have one?" "Not yet," I said. "You have to earn it." She frowned. "How?" "By remembering that you don't have to earn it," I said. She stared at me, puzzled, and I laughed. "You'll understand when you're taller." Years passed again. Seasons circled. My parents aged into quieter versions of themselves. The bitterness thinned, the need to explain dissolved. When my father's health declined, Ryan and I took turns visiting. In the hospital, he looked at me with eyes still sharp but finally unguarded. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I didn't ask about what there was no need." "I know," I said, and held his hand. He smiled faintly. "He always liked you best." "Maybe he just saw me better," I said. "That too," he whispered, and that was our peace. He died that winter. My mother moved into a smaller apartment and sent me a Christmas card that said, "He asked me to thank you for not hating us." I didn't. Not anymore. Hate is too heavy to pack for a long life. When Clara was 12, she wrote her first essay for school about the person who inspires me. She chose Uncle Martin, though she'd only known him through stories. She wrote, "My Aunt Claire says he believed money shows people who they are. I think kindness does too. He gave her everything, and she used it to give more away." That's math I understand. Her teacher sent me a copy. I framed it and hung it beside Martin's last letter. 10 years after the trial, we held another gala, this time in a larger hall, with students from every previous year. Some were accountants now, some teachers, some parents themselves. They spoke about perseverance, humility, balance. The kind of success that doesn't trend online. When the evening ended, I stepped outside to breathe. The air was cool and tasted faintly of the Hudson. Ryan joined me, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You realize," he said, "this started because they tried to steal from you." "No," I said. "It started because Martin trusted me not to turn that into the story." He nodded. "You did right by him." "We both did," I said. "You stayed human." He smiled. "You make it sound easy." "It wasn't," I said. "But it's easier than being cruel." He looked out over the parking lot, the streetlights making halos on the asphalt. "Clara wants to study finance, you know." "Of course she does," I said, smiling. "She's a Price. She wants to apply for the scholarship." "She'll have to earn it," I said, echoing myself. He laughed. "She will." That night, when everyone had gone and the hall was empty except for folded chairs and a stray napkin, I found myself alone by the podium. The microphone still smelled of breath and nerves. I placed my hand on the wood, cool and solid, and whispered, "Thank you." I wasn't sure to whom: Martin, the judge, the students, the version of myself who hadn't given up, maybe all of them. Outside, the wind stirred the banners still hanging on the door. I could hear water somewhere, a fountain, a pipe, the river itself. I reached into my pocket, felt the coin's worn edge, and thought of Martin's last advice: build something worth explaining to a child. I had. When I got home, I set the coin on the desk beside Clara's essay and Martin's letter. 3 generations, 1 ledger. Then, for the first time in years, I opened a blank page in my journal and began to write. I was the oldest daughter, the quiet one. I learned that fairness is not symmetry and that inheritance is not wealth. What we take, we turn into meaning. What we build, we leave behind. I have built steadiness. I have left the light on. The pen moved easily. The house was silent. Somewhere outside, the wind carried the faint sound of the river. I counted my breaths, not because I needed to calm down, but because I wanted to remember how air enters a room. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, build. Thank you for making it to the end. If it resonated with you, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. It will really help the channel grow.